Welcome back. Let everything slow. There is an old man in a wheelchair in the hunter's dream. He is the first voice you hear when you arrive there. He calls himself a hunter, in the way that people who have been a thing for a very long time use the word. Not as a title or a profession, but as an identity. He is welcoming. He is gentle. He tells you that he is sorry you've been dragged into the hunt, and that he hopes you'll find whatever it is you came to Yharnam for. He's been saying something like this to every hunter who has arrived in the dream since before any of them were born. He has been in the wheelchair for as long as most of the dream's permanent residents have known him. He tends the garden. He watches the cherry blossoms fall. He sleeps, and in his sleep he pleads with Master Willem, with Laurence, to be freed from the dream. He is not freed. He stays. He has been staying for a very long time. Tonight we begin before the wheelchair, before the dream, before the contract with the moon presence and the plain doll, and the grief that had produced the arrangement he had been living in ever since. We begin with Gehrman as a hunter, active, moving through Yharnam streets, training the students who would carry his tradition forward. We begin with who he was before everything went wrong, what the old workshop was, before the healing church had fully institutionalized the hunt, before Ludwig and the church hunters and the organized military approach to beast management that had defined the hunt's later period. The old workshop had been the center. Gehrman had built it, not as an institution in the formal sense, as the natural gathering point of the tradition he had developed, the tools, the weapons, the fighting philosophy that the Blood Ting and Arcane builds in the game document in their different ways. All of it originated in what Gehrman had developed through his own practice and passed on through the workshop. The trick weapons, the innovation that bears Gehrman's fingerprints throughout the game's item descriptions, blades that transformed between configurations that adapted to the demands of the hunt by offering both the reach of a large weapon and the speed of a small one. The burial blade, Gehrman's personal weapon, the trick sight that he carries in the final encounter, was the prototype, not simply his preferred weapon, the proof of concept for the entire weapon design philosophy that had shaped every trick weapon in Yharnam. He taught, not simply through the general influence of having developed the approach, through the individual relationships of a teacher with students. The hunters who trained at the old workshop learned directly from him, carried what he taught into their own hunting careers, became what Gehrman had made them. Among those students, Lady Maria, the Canehurst noble, who had come to the workshop and become the finest student Gehrman had ever trained. The woman whose quality, the precise and elegant fighting style built on the rakuyo, the preference for skill over blood, the particular quality that Maria had surpassed what the teacher had been able to produce in anyone else. What Maria was to him. The Maria Hunter set item description states it directly. She held great admiration for Gehrman, but was unaware of his mania. The admiration was mutual. Gehrman's feelings for Maria, whatever their nature, and the law is careful not to be too explicit about the precise character of the attachment, were the central emotional fact of his pre-dream life. She had been his student. She had become the finest hunter he had produced. She had developed in ways that went beyond what he had taught. had found in the tradition he had passed to her something that she made her own. The mania. This is the word the item description uses. Not affection, not admiration, not love in the simple sense. Mania. The quality of an attachment that has exceeded the normal bounds of what an attachment to another person is supposed to be, that has organized itself around the object of the mania in a way that is not entirely voluntary. Maria was unaware of it. She had known him as a teacher and as a fellow hunter, and as someone who had shaped what she became. She had not known that what he felt was organized the way it was organized, that the quality of his regard for her had gone somewhere that she was not aware of and would not have welcomed. She had admired him. He had built his world around her. The asymmetry between these two states was the wound at the center of everything that followed. The fishing hamlet and what it cost. The events at the fishing hamlet, documented in the old Hunters DLC's lore, were the crisis that the pre-dream period of Gehrman's life had been building toward. The hunters from Bergenwerth, who went to the village on the coast where Koss's body had washed ashore. The violation of the dead Great One's remains. The harvesting from the villagers. Whether Gehrman participated directly, whether he was among the hunters who went to the fishing hamlet and did what was done there, is one of the law's maintained ambiguities. The evidence that points toward his involvement. The doll's note that Gehrman sleeps more peacefully after the orphan of Koss is dead in the DLC. The quality of a sleep becoming more peaceful when a grievance is resolved suggests a connection to the grievance more direct than simply knowing about it. The closest reading supported by the law. Gehrman was the one who killed Koss, or the orphan in the material world. The act that completed what happened at the fishing hamlet. Whether as the leader of the expedition, or as the hunter who performed the final act, he was present and participated in the crime that Koss's curse was responding to. Maria had been there too. She was among the hunters at the fishing hamlet. She had participated in what was done, and the weight of what had been done, the violation of the dead god, the harvesting from the villagers, the crime that the hunter's nightmare had been created to contain, had produced in Maria the crisis that her quest line documented. She could no longer stomach it. The law's phrase, she could no longer stomach the thing she had done, preserves the quality of someone who had done something they could not continue carrying as simply something they had done. She threw her weapon into a well. She disappeared. She went into the nightmare. Whether voluntarily or through the curse's pull, she was in the nightmare. At the astral clock tower, tending the patients who had been damaged by the research hall's procedures, maintaining the vigil that her guilt required. And Gehrman was without her. The grief and the doll, what happened after Maria's disappearance, the sequence between her entering the nightmare and the Gehrman's eventual contact with the moon presence is not narrated directly. It is assembled from what the lore preserves. He made a doll, in her image, in the precise image of the person he had lost. The face, the voice, the proportions, the physical reality of someone who had been present in his life and was no longer there. He made it with the care of someone who was trying to preserve something, trying to maintain the presence of a person whose absence had been the event that had produced the mania's fullest expression. He could not fill the void with the doll. This is stated in the law's account of what followed, that the doll proved not enough to sate Gehrman's longing. Not because the doll was inadequate as a craft object. It was, by all accounts, an exceptional piece of work, because what it lacked was what it was made to approximate: Maria. The doll had Maria's face. It did not have Maria's soul, Maria's particular quality of being. What made Maria who she was, rather than simply what she looked like? He had made a memorial and found that the memorial was not the thing it memorialized. The moon presence and the contract, the abandoned old workshop, the item description found there, states that the 1/3 of umbilical cord found at that location was the catalyst used to summon the pale moon and form the hunter's dream. Gehrman summoned the moon presence, the great one whose domain was dreams, who could create and maintain a separate layer of reality that hunters could inhabit between their deaths and their returns to the material world. Was called to the old workshop by a man who had lost the person he was organized around, and who had found that the memorial he had created was insufficient. The contract. What Gehrman offered or requested in the exchange that produced the hunter's dream is not explicitly stated. What the law assembles from the outcomes, the moon presence, which was sympathetic, which answered when called upon, received Gehrman's situation and responded by creating the dream, by giving the doll a form of life, by making the workshop space into a permanent location that hunters could return to. The moon presence gave the doll life in response to Gehrman's grief. Not Maria's soul, not the thing Gehrman had been trying to recover with the doll, but life of a kind. The doll could move, could speak, could be present in the dream, in the way that an animate being is present rather than simply a static object, and Gehrman was bound to the dream in return. The form of the contract, the moon presence gained a focal point for its dream architecture, a host whose presence anchored the hunter's dream, and through whose position the hunters who died in Yharnam could be pulled into the space between death and return. Gehrman gained the doll's animation and the continuation of his existence within the dream. He would have preferred death. The law eventually makes this clear. The longing that accumulates across the dream's history, the pleading in sleep that the NPC dialogue preserves, the request he makes to the hunter at the game's end. Let him die. The contract that had preserved him had not been what he wanted. He had wanted the grief to end. The moon presence had offered continuation. He had accepted, and then discovered that the continuation was not the ending of the grief. The workshop in the dream. The hunter's dream workshop. The space that had been built from the material of Gehrman's old workshop. The same tools on the same shelves. The same environment of the place where he had trained Maria and all the others, now existing in the separate reality that the moon presence had constructed. The cherry blossoms, the detail of the hunter's dream's aesthetic that is most immediately affecting. The falling petals, the particular quality of the space that makes it feel like a place between seasons, between states, between the world, and wherever the dream leads. Gehrman tends the garden. The cherry blossoms fall. The messengers, small, eyeless, stumbling figures that serve as the dream's minor residents, move through the space with the particular quality of things that belong here. The grave, near Gehrman's workshop, accessible in the main game, is a grave. The doll can be found there at certain points, praying. The grave belongs to the person Gehrman had been trying to preserve with the doll he made. Lady Maria's grave, in the dream, in the space that Gehrman had built from his grief. The grave of the person the grief was organized around was present, a memorialization of someone who was not simply dead, but was in the nightmare, who was present in the world, even in her absence, in the way that people who are not gone are present. He had built her grave in the dream that her loss had produced. He tended the space around it. The doll, whose face was hers, prayed at it. Sleep well. 7 more parts remain, and the dream has been running for a very long time. The plain doll. She is the first person the hunter meets in the hunter's dream, who will speak to them with genuine warmth, not the distant warmth of an NPC performing a function. The quality of a being who seems, in some way that the game carefully never fully confirms, to actually care about the person in front of her. She levels the hunter. She prays for them. She says, when the hunter has insight enough to hear her properly, I don't dream, but I do appreciate the value of dreams. And I am here, and here I will remain until forever, I suppose. She has been here since Gehrman made her and the moon presence gave her life. She has seen every hunter who has come through the dream. She has watched them go out into Yharnam and come back and go out again. And she has watched most of them eventually not come back. She is the constant of the dream, not Gehrman, who sleeps in his wheelchair and is sometimes absent from the space, but the doll, who is simply always present. Tonight we follow her. What she is, what she is not, what her presence in the dream means for Gehrman, and the quality of what she became that was different from what he had made her to be. What Gehrman made. He made her from the desire to preserve something, not from craft pride or from any of the other motivations that a person might bring to a significant creative project. From grief, from the wanting that Maria's absence had produced in him and that had no other available outlet. The craft was extraordinary. Every account of the doll, the item descriptions, the visual design, the comparison that any player makes when they first encounter Lady Maria in the DLC and see the face they already know from the dream, confirms that what Gehrman made was a technically perfect reproduction. The face, the voice, the proportions, the physical reality of someone captured in a material form. She was a memorial first, an object made to contain the memory of a person, to preserve in accessible form the quality of someone who was no longer accessible, like a portrait, but three-dimensional, like a sculpture, but detailed enough that the person depicted was recognizable rather than represented. She was not made with a soul. This is the quality that the moon presence's gift addressed. Gehrman had made a technically perfect representation of Maria without the animating principle that would make it someone rather than something. The doll he made was, before the moon presence's intervention, exactly what the law's more uncomfortable readings suggest. A very detailed object made in someone's image by someone whose feelings for that person had exceeded normal bounds. The moon presence gave her life, not Maria's soul. The law is consistent on this point, and the doll herself is consistent on it. She is not Maria. She does not pretend to be Maria. She does not have Maria's memories or Maria's personality, or Maria's particular quality of being in the world. She has life of a kind, the animate existence that the moon presence's gift produced, and she has Maria's face and Maria's voice and the physical form that Gehrman had made. What she has, that is her own. The kindness, the warmth, the caring quality that the doll expresses toward every hunter she meets. The genuine interest in their well-being, the sorrow she expresses when a hunter dies or goes hollow, the prayers she offers. None of this came from Maria, whose item descriptions documented a personality that was quite different from the doll's gentle warmth. The doll's character is hers, produced by whatever process the moon presence's gift of life involves, emerging from the conditions of the dream and the function she serves within it. The gap between what he wanted and what he got. He had wanted Maria. He had made the doll to recover something of Maria. The moon presence had given the doll life. And then, the doll proved not enough to sate Gehrman's longing of Maria's return, and he soon became bitter of her presence. This is the outcome of the contract's immediate aftermath, stated directly in the law. The doll, animated, present, carrying the face and voice of the person Gehrman had made it for, was not what he had wanted, not because the doll had failed at anything, because what Gehrman had wanted was not a doll that looked like Maria. It was Maria. The doll's personality was not Maria's personality. The quality that Gehrman had been organized around, the particular fierce and determined quality of the woman who had been his finest student, who had carried herself with the precision of a Canehurst noble trained in the old workshop's tradition, was not present in the doll's gentle warmth. The doll was kind in a way that Maria had not been kind. The doll was complacent in a way that Maria had not been complacent. He had made a memorial and been given a companion. The memorial he had needed. The companion he did not want, or rather, could not want, because the companion's existence made the difference between the memorial and the person it memorialized inescapable. He became bitter, the law's word. Not simply disappointed or grieving, bitter. The quality of feeling that emerges when something that should have been a comfort reveals itself as a reminder of the absence it was supposed to address. The doll was there. Maria was not. Every time the doll spoke in Maria's voice, it was the voice without the person. Every time the doll moved in Maria's form, it was the form without the soul. He kept her. He did not unmake her or dismiss her or replace her with something else. He kept her in the dream, present in the space that his grief had built, because she was what the contract had produced, and the contract could not be undone. What the doll became, across time. The relationship between the doll and Gehrman across the long history of the dream's operation is not narrated in a continuous account. What emerges from the accumulated evidence is a picture of two beings occupying the same small space over a very long period of time, developing whatever relationship that proximity produces. He grants the hunter permission to use the doll, should it please them. This detail, preserved in what the NPC context establishes about Gehrman's relationship to the doll, carries the implication of someone who has processed across years of proximity that the doll is not the person he made her for, and has arrived at a kind of disconnection from what he had originally intended the doll to be. The doll, for her part, has the relationship to Gehrman that someone who has been present through everything has with the person who made them. She calls him Gehrman. She notes when he seems troubled. She addresses the moon presence as Flora, the name she uses for it, the title that the Japanese version confirms. in the relationship of someone who has been in the same space as a cosmic entity for a very long time and has developed whatever the equivalent of familiarity is. She prays at Maria's grave. The doll, made in Maria's image, prays at the grave of the person whose image she carries. Whether she understands the relationship, whether she knows that the face she wears is the face of the person in the grave, that the voice she speaks with is the voice of the person whose grave she tends, the game does not confirm. She prays, she tends. She is present at the grave in the way that beings who belong to a place tend to be present at the places in that space that matter. The doll and the hunters. Every hunter who has come through the dream has been greeted by the doll. Not all of them have paid attention to what that means. Many have simply used her leveling function and moved on. But for the hunters who stay, who return repeatedly, who accumulate the bond that comes from seeing the same face in the same space every time you come back from the place where things try to kill you, the doll is something that the game builds around carefully. She remembers them all, the loneliness of her situation, present in the dream, present at the leveling function, present at the grave through all the hunters who have come and gone, is not something she expresses dramatically. It is present in the quality of her care for each hunter, which is genuine and immediate, and does not seem diminished by the knowledge that most hunters do not survive, or that the ones who do will eventually stop coming back. She was made from grief and given life by a great one, and has been present in a dream for a very long time, caring for people who are dying and coming back from dying. This is what she is. The game does not comment on whether this is sad. It presents it and trusts the player to notice the weight of it. Her own statement about herself: I don't dream, but I do appreciate the value of dreams. She does not sleep. She does not have the experience of consciousness interrupted by unconsciousness that dreaming requires. She exists continuously in the dream, the place that is itself a dream, whose quality of being between the material world and something else defines its nature. She is the only being in the dream who does not move between the dream and somewhere else. She is always here. What her life in the dream is like. She tends. She moves through the space of the dream, appearing in different locations as the hunter returns from different stages of the main quest, observed in different parts of the garden and the workshop and near the grave. The movement is not random. Each location corresponds to the hunter's progression through the game, as though she is responding to what the hunter has done rather than simply wandering. She notices. The doll's dialogue changes across the game's progression. Different observations at different points, responses to the things the hunter has encountered. She does not have access to the material world in the way that Gehrman does not have access to it either. But she is aware, in whatever way the dream's logic allows, of what is happening. She grieves when hunters die. The expression of this, not dramatic grief, not performed sorrow, the particular quality of someone who has been watching people go out into a dangerous world and not come back for a very long time, and who has not found a way to be indifferent to the loss. She finds the hunter significant. Whether this is the significance of a hunter who has accumulated more insight than usual, or the significance of whatever the game's narrative logic designates the player character as, The doll's relationship to the hunter in the main game has a quality that her relationship to previous hunters presumably did not have. She says, at one point, in the way of a being who has been present for a very long time and has rarely been surprised, "I am being changed somehow by your actions. Strange. Very strange. She is changing because of what the hunter is doing." The game does not fully specify what the change is. It is present in her dialogue. A different quality to the observations, an awareness that something is different about this particular visit from this particular person. Something about the hunter is different from what the dream has seen before. She knows. She is changing because of it. And she continues to tend the grave and level the hunter and pray to Flora and watch what is building toward whatever the night will eventually produce. Sleep well. 6 more parts remain, and Gehrman is sleeping in his chair. The Moon Presence. The Great One, whose domain was the pale moon and the dream, whose name in the Japanese version was Flora, whose quality among the Great Ones was the sympathy the Carol Rune Moon described. The Great Ones that inhabit the nightmare are sympathetic in spirit and often answer when called upon. It answered when Gehrman called. The exchange that produced the hunter's dream was the moon presence responding to the summons, to the umbilical cord that Gehrman had used as the catalyst, to whatever cry of grief and need had reached the Great One and produced the decision to respond. Tonight we follow the moon presence. What it is, what it wanted, why it helped Gehrman, and what the dream served in terms of its own purposes, which were not simply identical with Gehrman's purposes, in the way that Great One's purposes are rarely identical with the purposes of the humans who interact with them. What the moon presence is. Every Great One loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate. This is the foundational statement about the Great One's relationship to humans, preserved in the game's lore as the explanation for why a species of cosmic intelligence would take such interest in a single city's worth of humans undergoing a blood scourge. They had children, whatever that means for beings of the moon presence's nature, the biological or cosmic equivalent of reproduction that Great Ones are capable of. The children did not survive. The gap between cosmic intelligence and material form produced beings that could not sustain themselves in either dimension. The children were stillborn or died before they could establish themselves. The Great Ones yearn for surrogates, not children in the conventional biological sense, beings who could fill the role that the lost children had been supposed to fill, beings who could carry a portion of the Great One's nature, who could exist in the space between human and divine in the way that the Great One's actual children could not. This is the mechanism that the hunter's dream served. The moon presence had found in Gehrman's summoning the opportunity it needed. A human who had lost someone he was organized around, who was in a state of grief, that made him open to the arrangement the moon presence needed. Not simply a bargain of convenience. The alignment between what Gehrman needed and what the moon presence needed had produced a contract that served both parties after a fashion. Gehrman was the moon presence's surrogate, the first hunter bound to the dream, anchoring the space that the moon presence's dream architecture required, serving the function of the child who had not survived. What the dream was for. The hunter's dream was not simply Gehrman's personal sanctuary. The moon presence had purposes for it that went beyond providing a space for a grieving craftsman to sit near a doll that looked like someone he had lost. The note found on the upper floor of the lecture hall. The nameless moon presence beckoned by Laurence and his associates. Pale blood. This note suggested that there had been deliberate summoning, that Gehrman's contact with the moon presence had been either preceded by or connected to the efforts of Laurence and the people associated with the Healing Church's founding. The moon presence was interested in the hunt, not simply as an observer, as an agent. The law suggested it was actively seeking out and trying to eliminate other great ones. And this was the theological dimension of what the hunt served. The hunters who went to Yharnam every night and killed the beast and confronted the great ones were, from the moon presence's perspective, doing something that served its interest directly. The hunt that Gehrman had built, that the dream sustained, that the moon presence had agreed to anchor, was also an instrument of the moon presence's agenda, not contradicting what the hunt did for Yharnam, not undermining the genuine purpose of protecting the city from the beast scourge. But the moon presence was using the hunters for something of its own. Whether Gehrman understood this at the beginning, whether the terms of the contract had included explicit acknowledgement that the dream would also serve the moon presence's interests, is not clear from the available law. What is clear? The dream served the moon presence. Gehrman served the moon presence through the dream. The hunters who died and came back through the dream were part of a mechanism that the moon presence had helped create and that it was using. What the moon presence looks like. The encounter with the moon presence in the game's third ending, when the hunter has consumed 3 umbilical cords and refuses Gehrman's offer, fights Gehrman and defeats him, and the moon presence descends, is one of Bloodborne's most extraordinary visual moments. It is enormous, not in the way of a large human or a large beast, in the scale of something that belongs to a different register of existence, whose size is the expression of its nature rather than simply its physical dimensions. The moon presence is the scale of a great one manifesting in the material world, which is to say, the scale of something that the material world was not designed to contain. Its form is insectoid. The elongated limbs, the articulation of a body that moves in ways that human biomechanics do not, the quality of something that looks as though it was designed for a different environment than the one it is currently occupying. White, near luminous, the pale color of the moon it is associated with. It is not simply threatening. The visual quality of the moon presence encounter is the combination of the enormous and the somehow sorrowful. It does not arrive in the spirit of a monster whose lair has been invaded. It arrives as a great one whose surrogate has been defeated, whose arrangement with the person in the wheelchair was now at its end. It does not speak. Great ones do not communicate in language in most of the game's interactions. Their presence communicates. The moon presence's presence in the final encounter communicates the quality of a being who has been patient for a very long time, and who has arrived at the moment when patience is no longer possible. What the moon presence does to Gehrman. The dream state. The quality of Gehrman's existence in the dream, sleeping in the wheelchair, tending the garden, occasionally engaged with the hunters who arrive, is not simply a natural rest. It is the moon presence's management of the surrogate it has bound to the dream. When Gehrman sleeps, he pleads. The NPC dialogue preserves this. In his sleep he pleads with Master Willem and with Laurence, two people from his pre-dream life, two people associated with the history that had produced the hunt and the dream. To free him from the dream, he is not simply resting. He is experiencing whatever the dream produces in its anchor when the anchor is asleep. The moon presence keeps him. The binding of Gehrman to the dream was not simply an agreement he had entered voluntarily and that he could exit voluntarily. It was a contract whose terms had produced an obligation. The surrogate remained in the dream for as long as the moon presence required. Gehrman could not leave. He could only offer to free the hunter at each hunt's end, cutting the cord that bound them to the dream, and wait for the hunt to produce the hunter who would eventually free him in return. He had agreed to this. At the time of the contract, whatever the terms were, he had accepted the arrangement. Whether he had fully understood what acceptance meant, whether the longevity of the imprisonment had been clear to him when he made the choice, is one of the questions the law preserves as open. The moon presence, for its part, had given the doll life, had created the dream, had provided the resources that the contract's other party had needed. It was not simply exploiting Gehrman's grief. It was making a bargain that it kept to the extent the bargain required. The moon presence's relationship to Gehrman is not cruelty. It is the particular indifference of a cosmic entity to the suffering that its arrangement with the human had produced. Not malicious, simply not organized around the human's experience of the arrangement. The moon presence and the hunter. When the hunter first arrives in the dream, pulled there by whatever mechanism the blood ministration and the Great One's intervention had produced, the moon presence had already assessed what they were. The moon presence's interest in the hunter was different from its relationship to previous hunters. The note in the lecture hall described the moon presence as beckoned by Laurence and his associates, meaning the summoning that had produced the dream was known to the church, was documented, was part of the institutional history that Bloodborne's various factions had been organized around. The hunters who had come through the dream before the player hunter had been the moon presence's instruments in whatever capacity the hunt served its purposes. This hunter was different in a way the moon presence apparently anticipated. The encounter at the game's end. When the moon presence descends after Gehrman's defeat, was not improvised. The moon presence was ready. It had been ready. The ending of the hunt that produced a hunter capable of defeating Gehrman was the ending the moon presence had been arranged for. It arrives to consume the hunter. The first ending where the hunter accepts Gehrman's offer is the ending the moon presence expects. The hunter is freed. The cycle continues. A new host will eventually come. The second ending where the hunter defeats Gehrman but is then consumed by the moon presence and bound to the dream is the ending where the moon presence's surrogate replacement function operates. A new anchor for the dream. The third ending, the one that requires the umbilical cords, is the ending the moon presence had not prepared for. The hunter, who has consumed enough of the Great One's umbilical material to resist the moon presence's consumption. Who can fight back? Who can win? What that victory produces, the hunter transformed into an infant Great One. the moon presence dead, the surrogate arrangement ended, and the doll, holding the infant, that was once the hunter, in the quiet of the dream, without either Gehrman or the moon presence any longer present. Sleep well. 5 more parts remain, and Gehrman has been waiting long enough. The hunter's dream has been running for a long time. Gehrman has been in it for all of that time, present as each hunter arrived, watching each one go out into Yharnam, watching most of them not come back, performing the same offer at the end of each successful hunt. Let me free you. Let this be over. Accept the mercy of the ending and return to the waking world. Most of them accepted. The vast majority of hunters who had come through the dream had eventually taken what he offered. The hunt ending, the return to the waking world, the completion of the cycle that the dream was designed to sustain. Some of them had not. Some had refused, had fought him, had been consumed by the moon presence, or had become the new anchor for the dream, or, in one case, across the entire history, had achieved something else entirely. Tonight we follow what Gehrman has seen across the dream's history. The accumulation of hunters, the wearing down that the position had produced, and the weight of a very old man in a wheelchair who wants nothing more than to not be there anymore. The hunters who came. Every generation of Yharnam's hunt had produced hunters, not simply the residents of the city who had armed themselves and gone out at night to protect their homes, the kind of person who had arrived in Yharnam from elsewhere, who had undergone the blood ministration and survived it, who had found themselves in the dream when the ministration and the Great One's interest had brought them there. They came from everywhere. The diversity of hunting equipment available in the main game, the different weapon traditions, the different armor sets, the tools that bore the marks of different cultural and institutional origins, documented the range of people who had come to Yharnam across the hunt's history. Some stayed for a single night. The hunt's ending could occur on the first successful night, when the hunter had accomplished whatever the moon required and had returned to the dream and been offered the release. Many took it. The first ending, the Yharnam sunrise, the hunter waking to the light of a morning in the city, was available to someone who had not accumulated the deeper insight that the other endings required. Some stayed for longer. The accumulated experience of multiple hunts, the insight that grew with each significant encounter, with each Great One's death, with each piece of the truth about Yharnam absorbed, changed whoever had accumulated it. The different endings available at higher insight levels reflected the different quality of a hunter who had been present for more of the truth. Gehrman had watched all of them, had sat in the wheelchair as each one arrived, disoriented, uncertain, carrying the freshness of someone who had just undergone the blood ministration and had not yet understood what it meant, had watched them go out into Yharnam, had watched the messengers bring news of their progress or their deaths, had offered the workshop's resources and the doll's leveling function and whatever guidance he thought appropriate, had offered at the end to free them. The weight of the offer. Gehrman's offer to the hunter at the end of the game is the most significant moment of his characterization. Not simply a game mechanic choice between endings, the fullest expression of everything his long time in the dream had produced in him. He frames it as mercy, He says, I will free you. He says, I am so sorry for you. He says, let me spare you the agony of the hunt. The framing tells the hunter that the offer is for their benefit, that what Gehrman is proposing, using his scythe to end the hunter, sending them back to the waking world, is the kind thing to do, the thing that spares them from what the hunt would otherwise cost. Whether this is entirely true, or whether it is also true that Gehrman needs the hunt to end as much as the hunter does, that his offer is as much for himself as for the hunter he is ostensibly freeing, is the ambiguity the game builds around the final encounter. He has been offering this to every hunter who reached the hunt's end. Most of them had taken it. The cycle had continued. A new hunter had eventually arrived. The dream had resumed its function. Gehrman had continued in the wheelchair. But the offer itself, repeated across however many hunters, across however many nights, had accumulated something. The wearing quality of performing mercy you want someone to accept for reasons that include your own desire for it to be over. This is present in Gehrman's characterization in the way that things present themselves through tone and body language, rather than through direct statement. He is gentle. He is sorry. He wants the hunter to say yes. He also wants the hunt to end. He wants what the hunt's ending would produce for him. Not through the hunter accepting his offer, which continues the cycle, but through the other ending where a hunter refuses and defeats him, and his own release becomes possible. The dream's loneliness. There is a particular loneliness in the hunter's dream that goes beyond simply being isolated or cut off from ordinary life. It is the loneliness of a place that exists between the material world and wherever the dream leads, populated by beings who are all present here as a consequence of circumstances, rather than as a result of having chosen to be here. Gehrman did not choose to stay in the dream in the sense of an ongoing choice. He made one choice, the contract with the moon presence. And the dream's continuation was the result of that choice, rather than a series of subsequent choices. He has been in the dream because the contract kept him there, not because he wanted to be. The doll has been in the dream because the moon presence gave her life here, and because the nature of her existence. The dream is where she is. The dream is what she knows. The dream is the entirety of the world she has. Does not give her a way out. The messengers have been in the dream because whatever they are, the small stumbling figures that serve the dream's functions, that the law connects to the earliest stages of the hunt and to the cosmic mechanics of the great ones. They are part of the dream's infrastructure. They are here because they are part of what here is. The hunters who come and go are not permanent. They are the temporary residents whose presence gives the dream its function. But they come and they go, and the permanent residents watch them do both. Gehrman has watched the hunters come and go for the entire duration, the long arithmetic of a succession of people who arrived and needed help, and went out and came back and went out again, and eventually either didn't come back or accepted the offer to not come back. And Gehrman watching all of it from the wheelchair, the garden not changing, the cherry blossoms falling in the same pattern they always fell. The doll was there for all of it. Whether her presence made the loneliness better or worse, whether the animosity that had replaced his initial attachment had become something else across the very long time they had shared the dream, or whether the animosity had simply become background noise he had stopped noticing. The law does not say. She tended the grave, he tended the garden. The messengers stumbled through their functions. The hunters came and went. The moon presence was present somewhere, in the way that great ones are present in the spaces associated with them. The sleep and the pleas. In his sleep, he pleads with Master Willem and Laurence. The people he calls for are not random. They are the people from his pre-dream life who had been most involved in the events that had produced the dream. Master Willem, the head of Bergenwerth, whose position on the hunt, eyes on our palms, see without eyes, the intellectual tradition of Bergenwerth as opposed to the blood-based tradition that Laurence had taken when he founded the Healing Church, had been the original context for the hunt's development. Willem was alive in the main game, in the state the law documented, his mind gone, sitting in a chair at Bergenwerth, pointing toward the Grand Lake with the gesture the game encoded as make contact. He was still alive, in whatever sense the word applied to his condition. Gehrman pleads with him, in sleep. The content of the pleading is not recorded, but the act of pleading with these people, in sleep, across the centuries of the dream's operation, suggests that whatever Gehrman believed they could do for him, free him, release him, end the contract keeping him in the wheelchair, was something he still thought possible, despite all evidence to the contrary. Laurence, the first vicar of the Healing Church, who had been involved in the moon presence's summoning according to the lecture hall note, who had become the burning beast in the nightmare, whose skull in the main game's Grand Cathedral connected the DLC's past to the main game's present. Gehrman pleads with him in sleep. Both of them were, by the time of the main game, unavailable. Willem was present but mindless. Laurence was in the nightmare burning. Whatever help Gehrman was seeking from them in his sleep was help that could not be provided. He continued seeking it. The sleep continued. The pleas continued. The dream continued. What Gehrman is waiting for. The condition Gehrman is in at the game's beginning. The slow conversation in the opening. The gentle welcome. The quality of someone who has been expecting this and who greets the hunter's arrival with the warmth of a host who has been hosting for a very long time, was the condition of someone waiting. Not simply waiting for the hunt to end, waiting for the hunter who would make the right choice at the hunt's end, who would refuse his offer, who would defeat him in the fight that followed the refusal, who would then face the moon presence and win. He had been offering his death as a gift to hunters who refused. The quality of the fight with him was that he was fighting to lose, not in the sense of fighting badly or holding back, in the sense of fighting the best opponent available and hoping to be defeated. His scythe was real. His capability was real. The fight was genuine. But the outcome he was hoping for was his own defeat. Every hunter who had come through the dream and refused his offer and fought him and won had freed him, until the moon presence arrived and claimed them, and the cycle continued, and he was bound again in the dream with a new anchor. He was waiting for the hunter who would also win against the moon presence, who would both free him and end the arrangement rather than simply extending it under new management. How long he had been waiting, how many hunts, how many refusals, how many victories against him followed by the moon presence's binding of the next anchor. The game does not say. Long enough that the waiting had become the condition rather than the anticipation. Sleep well. 4 more parts remain, and this hunter is different from the others. Everything in the hunter's dream had been building toward a single night, the night when the hunt would produce the hunter who had accumulated enough insight, who had faced enough of the truth, who had made enough choices across the darkness to reach the point where Gehrman's offer was the last thing standing between them and the end. The 3 endings of Bloodborne are the 3 possible answers to Gehrman's offer, not simply different game endings. 3 different statements about what the hunt was, what the dream meant, and what the relationship between the hunter and the old man in the wheelchair had produced across the night. Tonight we sit with each one, not as mechanical outcomes, but as the stories they tell, about Gehrman, about the doll, about the moon presence, and about what the long duration of the dream had been building toward. The first ending, Yharnam sunrise. The hunter accepts Gehrman's offer. They kneel before him in the workshop's garden, among the cherry blossoms, in a gesture of submission to what he is about to do. Gehrman uses his scythe. The hunter dies in the dream and wakes in the material world, in the real Yharnam, as the sun rises. This is the ending the moon presence expected. This is the ending that most hunters had taken. The quality of the Yharnam sunrise as a game ending. The hunter on the cobblestones, the sunlight. The doll bidding them farewell and wishing them well in the waking world is the quality of something that has completed its proper cycle. For Gehrman, the hunt continues. A new hunter will eventually arrive. The dream will resume its function. He will be in the wheelchair when the next hunter comes, welcoming them as he has welcomed every hunter before this one. He has freed someone. He has done the thing that his position in the dream exists to do, completed the hunt for a hunter who was ready to complete it, sent them back to the world they came from, performed the mercy that had organized his understanding of his own function across all the years of the dream. It is not enough. The doll says farewell. The garden is still there. The moon presence is still there. The wheelchair is still there. Gehrman is still there, as he has always been, as he will continue to be. The Yharnam sunrise is the ending that is most comfortable to take. It is the ending that most hunters take. It is also the ending that changes nothing for Gehrman. The second ending, honoring wishes. The hunter refuses. Gehrman's reaction to this, the word the game uses is disappointed, the particular quality of someone who had hoped for a different answer and who has been disappointed by the refusal before and who has been in this situation before and knows what happens next. He fights. He is not simply an old man in a wheelchair. The reveal of the first ending's alternative, Gehrman standing, scythe extended, moving with the speed and precision of someone who had been the finest hunter in the world before the wheelchair had become his home, documented what the dream's long duration had preserved. He could still fight. He was not fighting at less than his full capability, the fight's quality. He was not trying to kill the hunter out of malice. He was fighting because the hunter had refused the mercy he had offered, and because the contract of the hunt required that the offer be either accepted or contested. He was fighting the way that an old master fights a student who has grown strong enough to refuse what the master was trying to give them. with full capability, with something that might be described as a sad pride in the quality of what the student had become. When the hunter defeats him, when the scythe is still and Gehrman is on the ground in the posture of someone who has finally stopped, he says something. His words of defeat are the words the game had been building toward, his request, his longing, what the long time in the dream had produced. He says, "O Flora, of the moon, of the dream, why did you bring me here?" Not a battle cry, not a curse, a question, directed at the moon presence, at Flora, the name the doll uses for the great one who had bound him, who had given the doll life, who had created the dream from his grief. He was asking why. Not why this hunter had been sent, why any of it, why the contract, why the dream, why he had been here for so long. The moon presence descends. The hunter has defeated Gehrman and has not consumed the umbilical cords, has not accumulated the Great One material that would allow them to resist what the moon presence offers. The moon presence binds the hunter to the dream. The cycle continues. Gehrman is free. He is lying in the grass of the dream's garden. The cherry blossoms are falling. The doll is there, approaching him. The specific gesture of being with someone at the end of something. The warmth that she has expressed toward hunters across the entire duration of the dream, now turned toward the person who made her. He is out of the wheelchair. He is in the grass. He looks up at the blossoms falling. Whether this is death or simply the end of the binding that had kept him in the wheelchair, the law does not say, but he is no longer in the chair. He is not in the dream in the way he had been in the dream. The doll's expression in this ending, present beside him in the grass, is the specific thing the game chose to end with. Not his words, not his final statement, not any dramatic last communication. Just the doll there, with him, in the garden, that had been the space they had shared for all of this time. The third ending, childhood's beginning. The hunter refuses. They fight Gehrman and defeat him. The moon presence descends. But this hunter has consumed the third umbilical cords, the Great One material from the 4 possible cord items in the game, at least 3 of which are required for this ending. The moon presence cannot simply bind them. It tries. The mechanism of the moon presence's binding, the consumption of the hunter's existence into the dream structure, encounters the Great One material the hunter has consumed and finds resistance. The hunter is not bindable in the normal way. The moon presence fights, the combat of the final boss encounter, fighting a Great One in the hunter's dream, among the cherry blossoms in the space that had been Gehrman's prison, was not a conventional boss fight. It was the fight between a human who had made themselves more than human through the accumulated night of the hunt and a cosmic entity that had been using the hunt for its own purposes. The hunter wins. The moon presence falls, and the hunter transforms. The visual sequence of the third ending, the hunter dissolving, the doll present, the object that remains, produces an infant Great One. The human who had come to Yharnam for whatever reason they had come, who had survived the night of the hunt and accumulated the material of the Great Ones into themselves, was no longer human in the way they had arrived. The doll holds the infant. The image, the doll in the garden of the dream, holding a small Great One in her arms, is the image the game chose for its most secret ending. Not triumph, not horror. something that is both of those and neither of them. The quality of a thing that has happened and that cannot be undone, and that the doll is present for. She says, "Good night, Gehrman. May you rest in peace." And then, to the infant, "Whatever you are now, you are no longer a hunter. I want you to have that. You did well." She'd watched every hunter who had come through the dream. She had watched them go out and come back and go out again and eventually not come back or be freed. She had watched Gehrman in the wheelchair for as long as she had been alive. She had tended the grave of the person whose face she wore, and now she was holding a great one in her arms in the garden where the cherry blossoms fell. The doll's role in the third ending is the specific revelation of what her character had been building toward across the game. Not simply the leveling NPC, not simply the memorial Gehrman had made and the moon presence had given life. A being who had been present for everything, and who, when the everything had finally resolved, was there with the warmth she had been expressing all along. What the three endings say about Gehrman. The first ending, he is still there. The function continues. The mercy he offers is the mercy that keeps the function going. He freed the hunter, and he is in the dream waiting for the next one. The second ending, he asked why. The question, not the answer, which the game does not provide, just the question, was the thing he had been waiting to ask since the contract had bound him. "Flora, why did you bring me here?" Why had the moon presence responded to his summoning? What had he been for in this cosmic arrangement? The question is the thing, not the answer. The asking of it finally, after all the time in the dream. That is what the second ending gives him. The third ending, he is freed before the question could be asked. The exit from the dream that the third ending produced, whatever it was, death or release, or the resolution of the contract through the moon presence's defeat, did not include his question. He was freed. He was in the grass. The blossoms fell. Whether he found what he had been waiting for or simply found the ending is the ending. The doll in all three endings. She says farewell in the first ending. The specific warmth of someone who cares about where the hunter is going, wishing them well in the waking world, with the genuine quality that her dialogue had always expressed. She is present in the second ending, beside Gehrman in the grass, in the specific quiet of being with someone when something has concluded. What she says is not recorded in the same way. She is simply there. She holds the infant in the third ending. She says goodnight to Gehrman. She says, "Whatever you are now, you are no longer a hunter to the being that was once the hunter." She is present with the warmth she has always expressed, directed at the changed thing in her arms. Three endings, three expressions of the same character. In each one she is present, caring, doing what she does, which is be there for whoever needs someone to be there. She was made in grief. She was given life by a cosmic entity. She's been in a dream for a very long time. And across all three endings, she is the one who is simply present at the end of it. Sleep well. Three more parts remain, and the dream is quieter now. The Hunter's Dream Workshop. The space that is both the game's mechanical hub, where weapons are stored, where chalice rituals are conducted, where the character's home base is established, and the memorial that Gehrman's grief had built, and that the moon presence had maintained. It looks like the old workshop. The items on the shelves, the environment of a craftsman's working space, the tools that have always been there and that the dream had preserved across the entire duration of its operation. All of it is the old workshop, the real one that had been in Yharnam before the contract, and the dream and the chair. Except it is not the old workshop. It is the dream's version of it. The reproduction that the moon presence had constructed from whatever material the dream was made of, using the old workshop as its template. The real old workshop still existed in the material world, abandoned, accessible through a hidden passage in the main game, carrying the quality of a place that had been left behind rather than brought forward. Tonight, we follow what the dream preserved and what the difference between the dream and the real reveals about what Gehrman had actually built. The abandoned old workshop. There is a place in the game that requires a hidden passage to reach. The abandoned old workshop, accessible from the Cathedral Ward elevator hidden path. When the hunter first arrives there, the atmosphere is of a place that has not been used in a very long time. The tools on the shelves, the items that mirror what the hunter's dream workshop contains. Some of them, not all of them, in the way of a place that has been physically preserved while its contents have drifted across time. The abandoned old workshop has the items that the dream's workshop does not, and the dream's workshop has the workshop that the abandoned one has ceased to be. The umbilical cord. The 1/3 of umbilical cord found in the abandoned old workshop. The one whose description states it was the catalyst that was used to summon the pale moon and form the hunter's dream, was left here, in the real workshop, the actual place where Gehrman had made the doll and where the summoning had occurred. He had been here. This was the real space, the room where the grief had been worst, where the doll had been made and found insufficient, where the decision to call the moon presence had been made. The dream's workshop was built from this space, preserving what it had been. But the weight of the events that had happened here was left in the real workshop. The hunter who finds the abandoned old workshop is finding the origin, the place before the dream, before the contract, before the binding, before the compression of time and purpose that had produced the wheelchair and the garden and the cherry blossoms. The workshop as it had been when Gehrman was a teacher and Maria was a student, and the hunt had not yet produced what the hunt eventually produced, what the dream did not preserve. The dream preserved the workshop's form. It did not preserve its function in the original sense. The old workshop's function had been teaching, making, the activity of craftsmen and hunters learning from each other, passing knowledge forward, developing capability, building the tradition of the trick weapons and the fighting philosophy that Gehrman's innovation had produced. The dream's version of the workshop was not a place where this happened anymore. It was a place where the hunter came to retrieve weapons, and where Gehrman sat, and where the doll tended the garden. The absence of other hunters as permanent residents of the dream was part of what the workshop's function had become. In the real workshop, there had been multiple people at any given time. Students learning, hunters working, the social density of an active institution. In the dream, there was only Gehrman and the doll and the messengers and whoever was currently hunting. The dream had preserved the space and lost the life, not the doll's life. She was there, she was animate, she was the presence that the moon presence's gift had produced. but the life of an active institution, of people learning and making and passing things forward, that was gone. What remained was a stillness of a place that had become a museum of itself. The messengers, the small stumbling figures that populate the dream and appear in various places throughout the material world, leaving notes, placing items, serving as the interface between the dream's infrastructure and the hunting happening outside it. They look like infants, small, pale, eyeless, moving with a particular quality of things that are between states, not quite walking, not quite crawling, their proportions slightly wrong in the way of something that is not quite a person, but is organized along similar lines. The law's closest reading of what the messengers are, early forms of communication with the Great Ones, the stage of the cosmic development that the Great Ones represented, the small figures, the simple shapes, the forms that were present before full Great One nature was expressed. They are associated with the dreaming and with the relationship between human consciousness and Great One consciousness that the dream mediated. In the context of Gehrman's story, the messengers had been present since the beginning of the dream. They were part of what the moon presence's gift had produced. The infrastructure of a dream space required beings to maintain it, and the messengers were those beings. They had been stumbling through the dream since before any hunter had come through it. They are charmed by the doll. This is a minor detail the game preserves. The messengers gather around the doll in certain positions. The quality of small beings with an attraction to the larger presence they are near. Whether the doll finds this comforting or simply notices it, the game's visual presentation of the messengers near her does not specify. What it suggests, the messengers are not simply functional infrastructure. They are in some way responsive to the being who occupies the dream most completely, who is most fully present in it. The doll who has been there for all of it, who does not leave and come back and leave again, who tends the space continuously. The messengers are near her in the way of things that belong to the same place. The grave, Lady Maria's grave in the dream. Not the only grave in the dream. The game's art and environmental design suggest additional memorial elements, but the one that is most clearly identified. It is accessible. The hunter can go to it. The doll can be found praying there at certain points in the game. Gehrman's workshop is adjacent to it. The spatial relationship of the person who made the memorial living in proximity to the memorial he made. The emotional content of this arrangement. Gehrman had built his entire presence in the dream around the loss of Maria. The workshop was the space of what he had done before she was gone. The grave was the space of what remained after she was gone. He lived between them. In the chair between the workshop and the grave, in the position of someone whose entire existence was organized around the distance between what had been and what was. The doll prays at the grave. The being whose face was Maria's, whose voice was Maria's, whose physical form was the reproduction of the person in the grave. Praying at that grave, in the garden of the dream that had been built from the loss of the person the grave commemorated. Whether the doll understood the relationship between herself and the grave she tended, whether she knew that the face she wore was the face of the person there, or whether she prayed from the specific instinct of a being who belonged to the space and who had found that this grave was part of what the space required. the game does not confirm. What it shows, the doll at the grave, consistently, in the quality of a presence that belongs there. The real workshop's absence. The difference between the dream's workshop and the abandoned old workshop was the difference between a preserved form and a living function. The dream had taken the workshop and made it static, the same as it had been, but no longer doing what it had done. The abandoned old workshop, by contrast, had become what abandoned things become, dust-covered, slightly wrong in its specific spatial arrangement after years of nothing, carrying the particular atmosphere of a place that is waiting for something that is not coming back. What the abandoned workshop held that the dream did not, the truth of the event, the specific materiality of where the grief had been, the umbilical cord on the floor, the specific quality of a room where something significant had happened, and where the having happened was still present in the way that significant events leave their presence in spaces. Gehrman's absence from this space, his presence in the dream rather than in the real workshop, was the specific consequence of the contract. He was in the reproduction rather than the original. He was in the preserved memory of the workshop rather than in the workshop itself. Whether this was better or worse for the grief, whether being in the preserved memory was easier than being in the original space, is a question the law allows the player to sit with. The dream's workshop did not have the umbilical cord, did not have the specific material evidence of what had happened, did not have the weight of the original event in the way that the abandoned old workshop had it. It had Gehrman in the chair. It had the doll by the grave. It had the cherry blossoms falling. It had everything that the grief had produced, preserved in the form that the moon presence had made permanent. Sleep well. 2 more parts remain, and the hunt is almost over. Gehrman did not build the hunt alone. The tradition that had grown from his old workshop, the trick weapons, the fighting philosophy, the institution of the hunter's dream, had been taken up and extended and transformed by people who came after him. By the time the main games night began, the hunt Gehrman had started was barely recognizable in the organized military force that the Healing Church had made of it. Tonight we follow the figures who had taken what Gehrman built and made it into something larger, and what that something larger had eventually become. Not as background to the main game's events, as the context for understanding what Gehrman had been watching across the dream's long duration, what his tradition had been used for, what it had been turned into, and what he thought of it from the wheelchair where he had been watching. Laurence and the founding of the church. Laurence, the first vicar, the man who had split from Master Willem at Bergenwerth, who had taken the old blood and the soul arts and the knowledge that Bergenwerth had been developing and had carried them into the institution that the Healing Church would become. He had been involved in the Moon Presence's summoning. The note in the lecture hall documented his role. Laurence and his associates had beckoned the Moon Presence. Gehrman's grief had been the catalyst, but Laurence and others had known about what was happening, had been involved in it in ways the main game's law documented without specifying. What Laurence had done with the Hunt's inheritance was institutionalize it. The genius of the Healing Church's approach to the Beast Scourge, as opposed to the individual workshop tradition, was scale. a single craftsman and his students could protect a neighborhood. An institution could protect a city. The organizational logic that Laurence had applied to the old workshop's tradition had produced something capable of managing the scourge at the level the scourge's scale required. The cost of this institutionalization, the personal relationship between teacher and student that had defined the old workshop's tradition, was replaced by the institutional relationship between the church and its hunters. The hunters who came through the church were not Gehrman's students. They were the church's hunters. The knowledge Gehrman had developed was preserved and transmitted, but through a system rather than through the relationship. Laurence himself had become the burning beast in the nightmare. The first vicar, the institutional founder who had taken the old blood and built the church around it, had been consumed by what he had built the church around, in the way that the old hunter's DLC's lore documented. His skull in the main game's Grand Cathedral, his beast form in the nightmare. These were the endpoints of a life that had been organized around managing something that eventually consumed its manager. Whether Gehrman had known what would happen to Laurence, whether the long view from the dream's wheelchair had included any awareness of the trajectory that the church's founder was on, the lore does not say. He had known Laurence. He had pleaded with him in sleep. The relationship between the first hunter and the first vicar, two people who'd been associated at the origin of the hunt's most significant institutions, was not elaborated in the game's accessible lore beyond the pleading. Ludwig and the church hunters, Ludwig the Holy Blade. The most celebrated of the Healing Church's hunters, whose contribution to the hunt's institutional development was the church hunter organization itself, the approach that had made hunting a collective military force rather than a collection of exceptional individuals. Gehrman's tradition was individual. Trick weapons for one hunter, fighting philosophy for one hunter. The excellence of the single warrior developed through the relationship between teacher and student. Ludwig's tradition was collective. Uniforms, ranks, the institutional logic of an organization that could coordinate multiple hunters toward shared objectives, rather than relying on each hunter's individual excellence. The old workshop and the church hunters had different relationships to the hunt's fundamental problem. The old workshop produced extraordinary individuals. The church hunter organization produced reliable forces. Both were necessary. The problems of the beast scourge were sometimes problems that required the extraordinary individual, the monster that only Gehrman's student could address, and sometimes problems that required the reliable force. The neighborhood scale outbreak that required coordinated response rather than individual excellence. Ludwig was in the nightmare. The Holy Blade, who had been revered as the greatest of the church's hunters, was in the hunter's nightmare, consumed by the blood-drunk condition that the curse required be contained there. His body transformed by what the nightmare had done to a very powerful man across a very long period of beasthood. He had been there before the main game's events. He would be there when the old hunter's DLC's hunter arrived. What Gehrman knew of Ludwig's fate, whether the first hunter's awareness from the dream included knowledge of what had happened to the figure who had extended his tradition into the church's military capability, is not specified. The relationship between the hunter's dream and the hunter's nightmare was not simply ignorance. The doll prays at Maria's grave, which is the access point to the nightmare, and the connections between the two spaces are documented. But whether Gehrman could see into the nightmare from the dream, or whether his awareness was limited to the dream's own perspective, the law does not clarify. The workshop's students beyond Maria. Maria was the finest. The item descriptions are consistent on this. She was Gehrman's most faithful student, the one whose capability had exceeded what any other student had achieved, the one whose quality had organized Gehrman's attachment around her. There had been others, the hunters who had trained at the old workshop, whose names and histories are not individually documented in the main game's lore, but whose collective presence is implied by the existence of the tradition they had carried forward, had been Gehrman students before the church hunters had become the dominant institution. The powder kegs. The faction of hunters who had rejected the healing church's increasingly sophisticated approach in favor of the blunt instrument of the church canon and the practical philosophy of using whatever worked, had their roots in the old workshop's tradition, not church hunters, something older and less organized and more directly connected to the practical philosophy that Gehrman had developed before Laurence had taken it and built an institution around it. Jura, the old hunter who had given up the hunt, who had barricaded himself in the tower over old Yharnam, and who had refused to fight the beasts anymore, who had decided that the beasts were people who had been failed by the system that had produced them, and who deserved protection rather than killing, had been associated with the powder kegs. Not a church hunter, someone from an older tradition who had gone through the hunt long enough to arrive at a conclusion the institution could not accommodate. Whether Gehrman knew about Jura, whether the first hunter's awareness from the dream included the hunters who had been shaped by his tradition across the centuries, is not stated. What the lore preserves is the existence of these hunters as extensions of what Gehrman had started, taking his teaching in directions that the workshop tradition could have produced, but that the church had not. The night of the hunt, the night that the game depicted, the night when the scourge had reached its most extreme expression, when the blood ministration had spread the beasthood beyond the point that the church, hunters could contain, when the sky had taken on the quality of a night under the influence of the red moon, was one night in a long sequence. Gehrman had watched all the others, every night of the hunt, for as long as the hunt had been running, had followed a version of the same structure. The sun set, the streets became dangerous, the hunters went out, the beasts were addressed or not addressed, the hunters came back or they did not. Each night had been its own expression of the condition that Yharnam was in. This night was different, not in the way that different nights are conventionally different, in the cosmic way that the Old One's influence on a city reaches a threshold, and the transformations that threshold produces become visible. The blood moon, the red sky, the quality of a city that was being pulled in a direction that most of its inhabitants could not perceive, but that was happening to all of them regardless. Gehrman had been in the dream for all the nights before this one. He had watched hunters come and go, had offered his mercy at the end of each successful hunt, had remained in the chair while each completed hunt sent a hunter back to the waking world. He had been waiting, across all those nights, for the night when the hunter who would end the arrangement would arrive. This was the night. The hunter who had come to Yharnam for whatever reason. The blood ministration, the letter, the personal quest that the game's opening had implied but not specified, had been pulled into the dream and was now moving through the city. Whether Gehrman knew from the beginning of this hunter's arrival that this was the one who would change things, the lore is ambiguous on this. He greeted them as he had greeted every hunter, with the gentleness of someone who had been welcoming people to the dream for a very long time. He said he was sorry they had been dragged into this. Perhaps he was always sorry. Perhaps he said this to everyone who arrived. Perhaps this time the sorrow was different, carrying the weight of someone who could sense that the particular hunter in front of him was the one the long waiting had been waiting for. The tradition's end. The hunt that Gehrman had started. The specific old workshop tradition. The trick weapons. The individual hunter fighting the beast, scourge in the streets of Yharnam, had, across the centuries of the dream's operation, become something he had not started. The church hunters, the research hall, the choir, the school of menses. All of these had grown from or adjacent to the tradition that the old workshop had represented, in the way that institutions grow and diverge and sometimes contradict the origins from which they grew. The crimes at the fishing hamlet, which had produced the hunter's nightmare, had been committed by hunters. The research hall's experiments on patients, which had produced the horror that the old hunter's DLC documented, had been conducted by the institutional descendants of the tradition that Gehrman's old workshop had begun. Whether any of this was what Gehrman had intended when he built the workshop and trained the students who had carried the tradition forward. The question is the kind that does not have a yes or no. He had built what he had built. The tradition had gone where it had gone. He had been in the dream watching it from the chair for all of it. He was in the wheelchair in the garden of the dream's preserved version of the workshop he had built before any of it had happened. The cherry blossoms were falling. The doll was by the grave. The hunter was in Yharnam, moving toward whatever the night would produce. Sleep well. One final part remains, and the meaning of everything is still ahead. We have followed Gehrman from the old workshop and the students he trained, through Maria and the mania that the item descriptions preserved in that single word, through the fishing hamlet and the grief and the doll and the contract with the moon presence. We have followed the dream's long duration, the hunters who came and went, the pleading in sleep, the offer repeated to every hunter who reached the hunt's end. We have sat with the three endings and what each one said about what he was waiting for. Now we step back and we ask what Gehrman's story was doing. The specific tragedy of the first hunter. Every tragedy has a quality that distinguishes it from other tragedies. The tragedy of Artorias was noble failure. The best person for a task defeated by circumstances outside his control. The tragedy of Marika and Radagon was internal contradiction. Two souls in one being who could not agree about what they were for. The tragedy of the old hunters was institutional sin. The crimes committed in the name of the hunt by the people who were supposed to protect against them. Gehrman's tragedy is the tragedy of someone who made one decision in one moment of grief and has been living with it ever since. He was not a villain. He was not corrupt in the way that the healing church's later institutions were corrupt. He had not ordered the research hall's experiments or participated in the decision to hide the Omen children or built the machinery of institutional sin that the DLC documented. He'd been a teacher. He had trained Maria. He had built something that had been, at the old workshop level, genuinely good. A tradition of protecting Yharnam from the beast scourge through the excellence of individual hunters. The mania, that word, the specific quality of his attachment to Maria that the item descriptions preserved without judgment, just the word mania and the observation that she had not known. He had made a doll in her image when she was gone. He had summoned the Great One from grief. He had accepted a contract that bound him to the dream and given the doll a form of life that was not what he had been trying to recover. And then he had been in the wheelchair for a very long time, watching the tradition he had built become something he had not built, waiting for the ending that would free him. This is the tragedy. The decision had been made before it could be fully understood, and the understanding that followed it was an understanding that came too late. He had known, fairly quickly after the contract, that the arrangement was not what he had wanted. The bitterness toward the doll was documented as early, not years into the dream's duration, but soon after the moon presence had given her life, and he had found that life insufficient. He had wanted Maria. He had gotten the dream. He had been in the dream ever since. What the dream was built on. The hunter's dream is one of the most affecting spaces in Bloodborne precisely because of what it is built on. Every other safe space in From Software's games, the Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls, the Nexus in Demon Souls, the Round Table Hold in Elden Ring, is built on some form of cosmic architecture, a place where the dying can rest, organized around the divine mechanics of the setting. The hunter's dream is built on grief, specifically one man's grief for one woman. The personal loss of the first hunter, which had happened to many people before him in the history of the world and would happen to many people after him, had produced through the combination of the umbilical cord and the moon presence's sympathy a cosmic space, a whole separate reality existing between the material world and wherever the dream leads, populated by the messengers and the doll and the cherry blossoms and the grave. Every hunter who had ever come through the dream had been in a space that Gehrman's mania had built. Every leveling interaction with the doll had happened in the space that the moon presence had made from his grief. Every return from the hunt had been a return to the memorial that the loss of one person had produced. He had not built it for them. He had built it for Maria, and the moon presence had taken the architecture of his grief and made it into something that could be used for other purposes, and those purposes had been the hunt and its continuation. This is not cruel exactly. The moon presence had done what it had agreed to do. It had given the doll life. It had provided the dream. The use of the dream's grief architecture for the purposes of the hunt was simply what happened when a cosmic entity that needed a surrogate anchor found one whose grief had the right qualities for what it needed. The dream was built on grief. The hunters rested in it. They did not know what they were resting in. The space they had always associated with safety and the gentle warmth of the doll had been produced by someone's mania and a dead woman's absence. The doll and what she became. She had been made from grief. She had been given life by a cosmic entity. She had not been what Gehrman wanted. And then she had been present for everything. The entire duration of the dream. Every hunter, every returning dead, and every not returning dead. Every cherry blossom season in the garden that never changed. What she had become across that duration was the thing that the game presented as the dream's most genuine occupant, not Gehrman, who was there by contract and against his long-term preferences, not the messengers who were infrastructure, not the moon presence, which was elsewhere and everywhere and present in the way great ones are present. The doll was there, genuinely, in the way of a being who have found that the place they were was the place they were and had organized their existence around it rather than against it. She had no memories of Maria. She had no grief for the loss that had produced her. She was not carrying the mania that had made Gehrman bitter of her presence. She was simply the being the moon presence had made in the space the grief had created. And she had been that being for the entire duration of the dream. And what that being had turned out to be was someone who genuinely cared about the hunters who came through. This is the thing that makes the doll one of Bloodborne's most affecting characters, in the quiet way that characters who are not the protagonist or the primary antagonist can be affecting. She had been made for a purpose she did not know, by someone whose feelings she could not have understood, and she had become something that had nothing to do with that purpose and those feelings. She had become herself. In a dream built on someone else's grief, she had become genuinely her own thing. The question the game asks, Bloodborne's central question, the question it asks through the accumulation of the Hunt's Night and Yharnam's revealed horror and the Great One's relationship to humanity, is about knowledge and what it costs. Grant us eyes. The cry of the School of Menses. The attempt to access the Great One's knowledge directly, without the preparation that such knowledge requires. The eyes that people had been developing throughout the game. The physical insight, the seeing beyond what ordinary vision allowed, were the price of getting closer to the truth. For Gehrman, the question had been personal before it was cosmic. He had known his student was the finest hunter he had produced. He had not known that she was carrying the weight of the fishing hamlet's sin. He had known she was gone. He had not known from inside the dream the details of what had happened to her in the nightmare. The tower, the patient she had been caring for, the vigil she had taken on. He had known grief. He had not known the full shape of what his grief had produced. The dream, the space built from his grief, inhabited by the doll, who had been made to address his grief and had not addressed it, had preserved the surface of what he had lost without preserving its truth. The workshop existed in the dream. It did not exist in the way it had existed when Maria had been in it. The grave existed in the dream. Maria was not in the grave. She was in the nightmare, in the location that the old Hunter's DLC had placed her. He had built a memorial and been given a prison that looked like a memorial. What he was waiting for. The longing of the second ending. O Flora, of the moon, of the dream. Why did you bring me here? Was the question he had been building toward across the entire duration of the dream. Not just why had he been brought to the dream. Why any of it? Why the arrangement of a man's grief and a great one's sympathy and a doll's life had produced the situation he had been in for so long. Why the moon's sympathy had taken the form of this, the dream that was also a prison, the doll that was also a reminder of the absence the doll had been made to address. The question was directed at Flora, at the moon presence, at the specific entity that had made the arrangement. The question was also in the way of questions that are addressed at things that cannot be fully addressed, directed at the arrangement itself, at the combination of circumstances that had produced the dream and the chair and the garden and the cherry blossoms and the decades of hunters coming and going. Why did you bring me here was also why had any of this happened. The grief, the doll, the contract, the binding. Why had that night in the old workshop, the night when he had made the doll and found it insufficient and summoned the moon presence and accepted what the moon presence offered, produced this particular outcome? The moon presence did not answer. It descended. It tried to bind the hunter. In the endings where this worked, the question went unanswered and the cycle continued. In the ending where the hunter defeated the moon presence, the question went unanswered because the entity that might have answered it was gone. The question was the thing, not the answer. The accumulation of the dream's duration producing a moment of asking. This was what the long time in the wheelchair had built toward, not resolution. The ability to ask. One final image. The hunter's dream in the morning after the hunt. The cherry blossoms falling in the garden. The workshop behind. The tools on the shelves. The ritual table. The environment of a craftsman's space preserved in the way of a dream that does not age. The grave nearby. The flowers around it. The quality of a tended place. No Gehrman in the chair. In the second and third endings, the chair is empty. He is in the grass, or the arrangement has ended, or whatever the resolution of his part of the story produced, has produced it. The doll is there. She is always there. In the ending where the hunter accepted his offer, she is saying farewell. In the ending where the hunter freed him, she is beside him in the grass. In the ending where the hunter became something else, she is holding the infant in her arms and saying good night to Gehrman, and you did well to the thing that was once a hunter. The dream that is built on grief was also, in the end, the space where the thing that grief had made, the doll with her genuine warmth and her care, was present. He had not recovered Maria. He had not recovered himself. He had built a memorial and been given a prison and eventually been freed, or asked his question, or watched the person his tradition had produced become something the tradition had never produced before. He had been the first hunter. He had built the tools. He had trained the students. He had made the doll in the wrong person's image and summoned a great one from grief, and been in the wheelchair for the entire duration of something he had agreed to, before he understood what the agreement meant. His story was not the story of someone who had done something remarkable. It was the story of someone who had done something that a person in enough pain will do, reached for whatever was available to address the pain, and had found that what was available was not what he needed, and had been in the consequences ever since. He had been the first hunter. He was the last thing in the dream that belonged to the old workshop. And the doll, made in grief, given life by the moon, present for everything, was still there. This has been the entire Gehrman, and the hunter's dream timeline. From the old workshop and the students Gehrman trained, through Maria and the mania and the fishing hamlet, through the doll and the contract and the dream's long duration, through the 3 endings and what each one meant, to the cherry blossoms falling in the garden after everything had resolved, told slowly, for the quiet between waking and the pale moon. The hunt is over. For now, good night, my dear friend.